talking about economic measurements and indicators. So when we look at the economy of a country, what does it look like and how do we know what it looks like compared to other countries? So before we get started, just a couple things that are kind of review, background information, whatever you want to call it. Number one, macroeconomics versus microeconomics. Does anyone know the difference? You did it with your hands.
There's big economics and small economics.
Big and little, right? Macro is going to be big, countries, multiple countries. Micro is small, cities, towns, states, things like that. Okay, so we've been talking about a lot of microeconomics, a lot of smaller things. We're going into macroeconomics right now, the big stuff. Okay, and we're going to talk about what's called national income accounting. So it's measuring the income and the spending and the output of a country, seeing what's happening with a country's economy. So, without further ado, one of the big terms we're going to talk about today is GDP. Does anyone know what that stands for?
Gross domestic product.
Bingo. Gross domestic product. So if we break it down, gross is going to mean everything, nothing's taken out, right? Domestic is inside of a country, and product is what you've produced to sell. So putting it all together, GDP is the market value of all the final goods and services produced in a country within a specific time period. And that definition kind of starts setting up the rules for how do we know if something is part of GDP, right? So if we break it down, that means that it, number one, it must be a final good or service. It cannot just be part. So if we talk about the plumber who comes to your house to repair things, that final good or service is going to be what he charges you to fix the plumbing in your house. It's not going to be the parts and pieces that he uses. Or if we're talking about the manufacturing and selling of tires for cars, it's going to be the tires or the whole cars, not just the rubber. Not the raw materials by any means. It also must be produced within the time period. Not just sold. So if we say GDP for the year 2005, that means the things have to be made in the year 2005. They can't be sold in 2005, but they were made in 2003. It disqualifies it. And then alongside that, it has to be produced within the country's borders. If it's manufactured in China and sold in the United States, it does not count. Okay, so that's the qualifiers for something to be inside of GDP, for something to count. Make sense so far? Okay, Now let's talk about how do we get GDP? How do we figure out that number? Because it's a number that we use to judge economics. Anyone need a second to write this down, or we got it? Okay. So, to calculate GDP, it's actually really just addition. This is the simplest economic math problem that exists, I swear. You just have to know what goes into it. So when you're calculating it, you use what's called the expenditures approach. And the formula for that looks like C plus I plus G plus X equals GDP. Like I said, you're just adding everything together. You just have to know what things you're adding. And the concept of expenditures approach, it's you take the expenditures, the money that's spent, add them all together. So you're going to start with C, which is consumption. What is consumed? That is going to be household spending. So when you go to the grocery store and you buy things, that's included in consumption. Next we move up from consumers to businesses. That's going to be investment for the I. Which is just business spending. So if we have regular people, consumers spending money, and then we have businesses spending money, who's the other entity that spends money in a country?
Government.
The government. So G is government spending. And the last one's a little tricky because we think, okay, this is all the money that gets spent within a country. But then you think about, okay, but what about other countries? What about foreign trade? And the last one that we add together is called net exports. You'll see where that X comes from right here in exports. This is foreign trade. So when we take into account the goods and services produced in the United States, but that we sell elsewhere. If Nike makes and manufactures shoes here and then they are sold on a foreign market, they're counted in part of our GDP because they were made here. Now, there are two types of GDP to worry about. The first one, this is like the fantasy one, the fictional one. We don't take into account real life. It's called nominal GDP. Nominal GDP does not factor in price changes over time. What happens to prices of goods and services as time goes forward? They go up, down, stay the same. They always go up, right? But nominal GDP doesn't factor that in. So when you're comparing the years 2023 and 2024, the GDP for a country, if you're using nominal GDP, you're not getting an accurate representation because it doesn't take into account the fact that prices have changed. However, if you want an accurate representation, simpler word to remember, is real GDP. It's the real thing. It's adjusted for that change over time in prices. Everybody got this? Cool. Let's keep going. Okay, but what about what is left out of GDP? What things are not GDP? What's not inclusive? Included, rather. Number one, non-market activities. Where something happens but money does not change hands, or it doesn't change hands on paper, right? If you pay someone cash under the table for fixing your plumbing, guess what? That's not going to count in GDP. If you volunteer to fix someone's air conditioner for free because they're your relative, it's not going to count in GDP. If you take care of your siblings and your parents pay you an allowance, guess what? Not in GDP. Because it's not on paper market activity, okay? The other things that don't count are going to be the underground economy. Thank you for the sound effects. Underground economy just means it's like the black market, okay? So things like illegal activities and drugs and stolen goods, things that are being highly rationed when they're sold, that's underground. They don't want it on paper. It's not going to be on paper. It's not in our GDP. And lastly, the GDP does not measure the quality of life in a country. So you could look at the United States and say, wow, they have such a high GDP. They must be such a great country. They've got so much money, so much wealth. But it doesn't take into account the fact that there are people who are starving and homeless, right? That's not factored into that number. It's just what the economy is doing, nothing else. And there are other ways of measuring the economy as well outside of GDP, depending on what you're wanting to look at. Call them other economic performance measures. So, some of them have to do with GDP and some of them are kind of separate. So, GDP, like we said, is gross domestic product. It's the value of all the final goods and services in a specific period of time. Well, then we also have GNP, which is gross national product. National, right? Yeah. And gross national product is the GDP, but you add on your exports. Instead of using net exports, you add on all of the exports. So it's almost the same thing. It's just a little bit more. And then we have net national product. What happens to the machines in a factory after 15 years of use?
Break down.
They break down. They wear out. Things have to be replaced, right? And that takes away money from the company. Now, national net product is where we take the previous number, GNP, and we take out take away depreciation for things that are wearing out and breaking. Or when things just aren't worth as much over time. So it knocks out a chunk of the money because something isn't worth as much. Okay, then we have something called, this one's one of the simple ones, national income. It is exactly what it says it is. It is all the money that comes into the country, not just based on sales, all the money that comes in. Then we have personal income. Which is the money that is paid to citizens of a country. So how much are those people in the country making as opposed to, the companies saving up all the money, the billionaires holding on to it, not letting it trickle down. And then there's something called disposable personal income. Disposable personal income is probably your one that's going to measure your quality of life a lot more than GDP, because that's how much money do people have left over after they've paid their taxes, after the government's taken their chunk. So is there next to nothing left, or do they have a lot of money left to spend on their regular needs, right? Okay, everybody got this? Let's keep going. So we talked about the ups and downs and ins and outs of GDP. Let's talk about how it moves, because it's not going to stay the same all the time. Our economy is consistently changing, right? So when it changes, we call that the business cycle. And because it is a cycle, it goes in a circle. It happens over and over again. Sometimes it changes, takes longer, shorter, depending on what goes on. And we'll talk about some historical examples in a little bit. But we start, in theory, with expansion. Expansion means the economy is doing great. We are expanding. We're getting bigger, better. There are lots of jobs. And the economy is awesome. When you talk about an economic boom, that's going to be expansion. When you talk about the roaring 20s, right before the stock market crash, where everyone was living it up, having a good time, spending all their money, that was a period of expansion. Then you keep going up and up and up, and it has to stop. There has to be a tipping point. There has to be a top of the mountain. And we call that the peak. This is where real GDP is at its highest. It can't keep going up forever. This is where it stops. And when it stops, we start tumbling down the mountain, right? Something happens. The stock market crashes. The housing market does something weird. And we start rolling down the mountain. That is called contraction. The big squeeze, if you will. Squeeze on your wallet, squeeze on companies. We're talking cutbacks, scarcity, recession, depression, stagflation. All of those things happen during contraction. I'm going to forget what I just said. People start getting fired. Hard to find things on the shelves. It's interesting because there's also a fashion element to this. Did you know fashion and the economy had things to do with each other? So whenever the economy is doing bad, skirts get longer in fashion and pants get more fabric to them at the bottom. As almost a way of protest of we're not supposed to be spending money, but look, I put all this fabric in my pants. I'm covering up my legs because the economy is bad. But when the economy is great, skirts get really short. Think about, like I said, the Roaring 20s. You had flapper dresses, these dresses that are really just scantily clad. The economy was great, so we were wearing less and less clothes. During the Depression, long sleeve, pants, overalls, jeans, things like that. So watch fashion to see how our economy is doing. Okay, and once we are rolling down that hill, we can't go forever. It does eventually stop, and we call that a trough. And that is the opposite of the peak. The GDP is at the lowest. And then slowly it'll start coming back up again. It's a cycle that repeats. And there's a couple of terms that we've heard before. We're going to modify them a little bit now. Everybody remember when we talked about supply and demand? I almost butchered those really bad. We remember that, right? What do we call it when supply and demand, when they cross over and they meet in the middle? Where the same amount is supplied as are demanded.
Economic equilibrium?
Equilibrium, right. So, we're just going to add a word in front of those today. The word we're going to add in front of them is aggregate, which just means total, all of it. So, when we have aggregate demand, that is the total amount of goods and services bought at every price level by everybody. And then you can guess the same thing about supply. If we've got aggregate supply, it's the total supplied at every price level. And when we talk about it crossing and coming to equilibrium, now because we're talking about big scale, we're talking about a whole country, we're going to call it macroeconomic equilibrium. There's no surplus, no shortage. We've made just enough for everybody. Do you think that happens very often in an economy? Not really. So, changes in these, the supply and demand, cause the business cycle to happen. This happens, which causes this, okay? So, different things that can change supply and demand, right? When businesses make decisions to change things, if they're going to increase the production or decrease it, if they're going to put more on shelves or less, if they're going to increase prices or decrease them, when interest rates change, that's a big one. When consumers have different expectations about the economy, when the economy's bad, do people spend a lot of money or no? No, not at all. They hold on to it, right? What about when the economy's great? We're living it up. We're spending it all over the place, right? So if consumers think the economy is going to be in a good place, they're going to spend more money. If they think it's going to be a bad place, the opposite happens, which again affects the business cycle. And then external issues, things like natural disasters and wars and nationwide traumatic events and things like that. Things like if a president is assassinated, or there's a bombing, or if there's wildfires in California, things like that are going to change the business cycle because people get scared or worried about things and they change how they spend money. So the business cycle can be predicted to an extent based on something called indicators. Indicators are just things that we see happen before or after a change in the business cycle, right? When things go bad, we know the economy's about to go bad, etc. That's the simplified version. So let's go history-wise. Who remembers what happened in 1929? What?
Won the line.
You weren't alive? Yeah, you weren't born yet. But you've had a history class before, right? I hope. Some type of history class. What happened in 1929? We said the 20s were the Roaring 20s. What ended the Roaring 20s?
The Great Depression.
The Great Depression. The stock market crashed. So that is that contraction in the business cycle, right? Something happened that caused the economy to go bad, the stock market crashing, and we started to tumble down that hill, right? So from 1929 to 1933, guess what? It didn't get better. It got worse. We also had, the Dust Bowl that happened, and so farmers lost their crops. And the fields turned to dust, right, over the course of time. So we had lots of GDP decline. It went down, and we had cutbacks and high unemployment. But bad times can't last forever. Does anyone know what President Roosevelt did in 1932? I know that's oddly specific. Any ideas? Anyone heard of the New Deal program? President Roosevelt came in and said, hey, our economy's doing really bad. Nobody has a job. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to hire everybody through the government to build things like national parks. So we gave all these people jobs through the New Deal. And he did some other stuff too, but basically, this meant that we had more government spending, so money is being put into the economy. That's why nowadays, when things go bad, we start seeing bailouts, right? The government puts money into the economy by giving it to the businesses. And we also started to see more business regulation by the government. We've talked about it more than once. What happens when the government stops regulating industries? Is it great or is it horrible?
Horrible.
Everything goes bad when the government stops regulating it because these companies only have themselves in mind. They don't have anybody else in mind. So they only do what's in their interests. That's how we get things like crazy interest rates on loans. Remember, that was something we talked about like last week or the week before. Or remember the airline example where they took away regulation from the airline industry, and so all these different airlines stopped offering amenities and stopped being as safe and started going down in price, and a lot of them went out of business because there was no consistent regulation. So we're on the increase again. Okay, we're expanding our economy with a New Deal, government spending, more business regulation. And then what war ended in 1941?
World War II started.
Do I have the dates wrong? I have it written down. Let me Google it real quick. I have it. The date was wrong in the book, or I wrote it down wrong. Hold on, we're gonna check the book real quick.
Yo.
Sorry, we entered World War II in 1941. That's where I got mixed up. Which caused the government spending to rise even more. What do we know about war in the economy?
They're not good for each other.
Actually, generally speaking, war is really good for the economy. It gives you an economic boom of sorts because everyone has a job to do. Everyone's rationing and not overusing things, and we're pushing things for war effort. Now, when we no longer fight wars in the way that money is being spent on it and it affects us in our day-to-day lives and we're going to factories, like if we're no longer doing that to help the war effort, it doesn't do as much for an economy, which is why the war is not as good for our economy nowadays. But back World War I, World War II, this pushed manufacturing, it pushed technology, and by the end of World War II, there was full recovery, which was 1945. And everyone came home from war and they said, not only have we missed our wives because we've been at war, they said, the economy is doing great now because of the war. Let's have babies. So you had multiple reasons that we had the population boom after World War II. Because where else are you going to spend your extra money? Everybody got these? Need a second more? You good? Okay. Almost done, you guys. Okay. Lastly, let's talk about economic growth. Okay. Economic growth is going to be measured by an increase in real GDP. We can't just worry about nominal. Okay, it has to be real. And we can use that information to divide it into what's called real GDP per capita, which is where we divide it by the population to really see how it's affecting each person. There are some factors that affect economic growth. All these things can change the economy and push it forward. Okay? Hold on. Things like natural resources. Guess what? When we find a big area with a lot of oil in it, we're going to go use it. It's going to increase our GDP. Human resources. Or labor. Whenever you have more skilled labor or a bigger population, that will change your GDP. And we have capital. There's more factories, more workers, more technology, things like that, that can push us forward economically. And then finally, technology. I know I just said it, but and we have innovation that makes the technology that we use faster, better, stronger, more long-lasting, more efficient. All of that pushes our economy forward, increases our GDP. Make sense? Got it? Any questions? Cool.